Hello everybody and welcome back. So in this Golang tutorial, we're going to talk about functions. Now functions are very important for any programming language and especially in Golang. So let's talk about what a function is, and then I'm going to go through a bunch of examples, and in the next video in this series, we'll actually get into advanced examples with functions. So just keep in mind that if I don't cover everything here, it's probably coming in the next video. Okay, so what is a function? Well, I would say that the easiest way to define a function is a block of reusable code. Seems pretty vague, but that's really all a function is. It's this block of code that you can reuse as many times as you'd like, and you can reuse it because you can call a function, you can pass a value to a function, and a function can return a value back to you. The most common example of functions I like to use is something like the absolute value function. So what does the absolute value function do? Well, it takes some value x and returns to you the absolute value of x. That is what that function does. Now this is reusable because I could pass in any value, so I can pass in -5, and that would return to me the absolute value of -5, which is equal to 5. This is an example of a function. It takes one value in and it spits one value out. Now there is some functions that don't take any values in. That's totally fine. You could have a function that just prints something to the screen. You could have a function that takes something in but doesn't return a value. So maybe it takes the value x and rather than returning that value, it prints it to the screen. This will make a lot more sense as we get into the examples, but I just want you to think about the keyword function and what that really means, because that's going to be important when we make functions to think about what this block of reusable code is doing, how we should name it, is it returning things, is it taking values, but let's get into that now. So the first example of a function that we've seen in all of these videos is function main. Now what is this? This is simply a function that does not take in any values, it does not return any values, it simply does whatever is inside of these brackets here. So this is the entry point for our application, and we know that we'd have to have been writing almost all of our code inside of this function so far. And whatever happens in here just runs and that executes fine. Now we can actually make our own functions, and I'm going to show you how we can do that. So I'm going to write function, I'm just going to say test like that, and do my square brackets or my squiggly brackets. So now I have a function called test. Doesn't do anything right now, but I've defined a function test. And inside what I'm going to do is I'm going to say fmt.println. Oops, let's put our quotation marks. I cannot type today. Let's do test. Now this function test is just sitting here, nice, perfect, nothing wrong with it. The only problem is right now, if I go ahead and run my code, so go run tutorial.go, nothing's going to happen. There's going to be no output from my program, and you can see that down here, nothing happened. That's because this main function ran, but it didn't automatically run this test function for me. So how do I call a function? How do I actually get this function to work? Well, what I do is I simply write the name of the function followed by 2 parentheses like this. Now, sometimes, actually, I won't even go into the example I was about to say there, but this is how you call a function. You simply put the name of the function, you put 2 parentheses afterwards, and then sometimes there's a few other things you need to do, but for our basic example, this is how we call it. Now, what this means is I am telling this function to run. So just do whatever is inside your function. That's what that's saying. So when we hit this line, it will run whatever's in test. You can think of it as like from line 10, we jump to line 5, and we run whatever's inside of there. So let's actually go and run this and see what happens now that we call test. There we go. We get the value test printed out. Now the reason functions are great is because I can reuse them and call them multiple times. So look at this. I can call test again a second time, and look what's going to happen. Test prints out twice. So I call test once, it runs through the function, and then boom, we're done. We come down to this line, line 11, we call it again, and it runs. Great, that's the basics of functions and how you call them. Now let's talk about parameters and return types. So just like the absolute value function that I showed you at the beginning, functions can take in values. So what I mean by take in values is they can accept a parameter. Now, a parameter is simply a variable or a piece of data, something that we give to the function when we call it. Sometimes they can be optional, they may be mandatory, we'll talk about that later, but let's make a parameter x that we pass to test. So if I want to tell my code that when we call test, we need to pass one value for the parameter x, then what I do is I simply write the name of the parameter that I want here, so the value that I'm expecting, and then I write the type of what this parameter should be. So if I want this to be an int value, if I want them to give me an integer, then what I would do is type int directly after the variable. So x int like that. Now what this is going to allow me to do is use the value x inside of test. So in fact, I could print out test, and actually let's just print out the value x. So printing out the value x, what this says now is, okay, we have some parameter x that we pass to the function. Let's just print that value out. So let's have a look at how we now call this new test function. Because if I save this code and I wait for the little squigglies to pop up, is it giving it to me? Yes, it's saying not enough arguments to call test. So what's up here is known as your parameters. And what you need to do when there's parameters for a function is you need to give what's known as an argument in your function call. So I'm going to call test with the argument 5 and test with the argument 9. Now take a guess at what you think this is going to do, but it's pretty straightforward. We go ahead and go run tutorial.go. We print out 5 and we print out 9. Because when we pass 5 here, x gets assigned the value of 5, we print it out. When we pass 9 here, x gets assigned the value 9, we print it out. Now we can have multiple parameters as well. Let's go ahead and actually add in a y parameter. Let's change the value of this function to be add. So what I want to do now is I want to add the value x and y and print that to the screen. So let's add x plus y and print that out. So now I'm going to call test, I called this add, and we'll give it 6 and 7, and we should assume what the result's going to be here, but let's have a look. And we get 13. So we can do things like that. Now these are how we type in parameters. You simply put the name of the parameter and the type. If I wanted this to be a floating point number, I would put float 64. If I wanted it to be a string, I would put string. If I wanted to be some custom data type, which we haven't talked about yet, I would put the custom data type there. Now, a little shortcut for functions here is that you can actually, if you have parameters that are the same types, is omit writing it 2 times. So I can actually do x comma y int, and what that means is x and y are both ints, just because I put that here and we didn't define a type for x, but we defined one for y, so it's going to assume that x is an int. So look at this. If I run this code here, this is completely valid. There's nothing wrong with this. We still get 13 printed out. So that's what you can do if you have multiple parameters that are all the same type. Just list them all out and then put the type at the end. They don't need to be, you don't need to write ints that many times. Now, of course, we can have parameters of different types too. I can have x being a string and y being an int. Obviously, we can't add these now, but we can do that. That's totally valid. Okay, so let's go back to the example of x, y, int, and add. Now here, notice that what I was doing was printing this value out. Now, instead of printing this, what I actually want to do is return this value. Now, what that means is give this value back. So do this calculation and give this value back to wherever it was called from. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to say ans colon equals add, and I'm going to say fmt.println ans. So what I'm hoping is going to happen now, and I have to change this function, is that when I call add, rather than it printing out, so rather than add printing out x plus y, it just gives me the answer. So it returns to me what the answer is, and I can store that in the variable ans. So how we do that, how we set up a return type or multiple return types from our function, is we define after the brackets and the name here what the return type is going to be. Now in this case, it's going to be an int, so I simply write int. But if we returned a float, then maybe I would write float 64 there. And if I was returning multiple things, I would write multiple things. So int comma int. That means I'm returning 2 int values from this function. So let's actually see what happens when I have one int here. So whenever we define that we're going to return something, we need to write inside of our function a return statement. And the return statement is telling us what value or what values we're going to return back to the caller, so wherever this was called from. Keep in mind, whenever we hit a return statement, we immediately exit our function and we send whatever was in that return statement back to what was called. So if I go here and I say return x plus y, what this is really saying is, okay, we're going to call the function add with the value 6, 7. We're going to return the sum, so 6 plus 7, to add, which means this statement add 6, 7 gets replaced with their sum, which is 13. And that means answer now becomes equal to whatever that value was, in this case, 13. So let's have a look at how this works. Go run tutorial.go. And we get 13 again. Now, of course, if I change this to be 14, then we can see that this function will still work properly, and we will get 21 as our answer. So that is how you set up the parameters and how you set up the return type. Now, for some reason, you might want to return more than one thing. In that case, you just add another variable here that says the 2 things you're going to return. So I'm going to return 2 ints. And in this case, I'm going to return x plus y and x minus y. So now let's have a look at what ans is equal to if I do this, or if this is actually going to work. So let's go run tutorial.go, and let's see what happens. Missing function body, syntax error, unexpected comma after top level declaration. Okay, so I actually remember what's wrong here. My apologies, guys. When we return multiple things, what we need to do is put them inside of their own set of brackets, just so that the function knows that this is the return type, not multiple things. Okay, so we need to put them inside of a set of brackets. My mistake on that. But once we do that, so assume the function is fine now, we're returning 2 integer values, we're going to have to modify this line of code down here because right now we only have one variable that's going to store the return from this function. So I'm going to say ans1, ans2, standing for answer1, answer2, and then I'm going to change this to ans1 and ans2. What this is saying is since we're returning 2 values, when we make this variable declaration, we need to define 2 variables so that answer1 becomes equal to x plus y and answer2 becomes equal to x minus y. So let's run that and run this code now and have a look at what we get. And we get 21 and 7. So we get those 2 separate values, and that's how we return multiple things. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few more cool tricks that we can do with Golang functions, and then in the next video we'll do some more advanced examples. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is actually labeled return values. So I can go ahead and do something like this. Z and ZZ, I know these aren't very meaningful names, but let's do Z2 and Z1. I can actually label my return variables. And if I do that, what that means is I actually don't, there's a different way that I can do this. So if I have these labeled, I just need to show you this example, sorry. I can actually assign, I can say Z1 equals X plus Y. Oops, I don't want to add Y again. Z2 equals X minus Y. And I can simply write return here. Now what this is saying is I've labeled Z1, which is my first return variable, and I've labeled Z2, which is my second return variable. So I've set them equal to X plus Y and X minus Y. Now when I return, this will actually automatically return these values for me without me having to write Z1, Z2. So I can do something like that. If I label these return types, then I can just assign what it is I want to return somewhere in the function, write the return keyword at the end, and it will return those values. So let's save this and let's run this and see if I made a mistake or not. And it looks like this is still working fine. So we can do that. We can label the return types, and I can do the same thing that I've done here where I can say Z1, Z2 int, and this will still be valid. So let's have a look at this. And we're good. So this is just a short form. When they're the same type, you can do something like this. So there we go. We've labeled it now. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is what's known as a defer statement. So a defer statement defers the execution of whatever we put on this line until the function returns. So this seems strange, but let's say that I want to print something right when the function stops executing, or right when the function is about to return. What I can do is I can say fmt.println hello, like that. And what this says now is that we will defer the execution of this until we hit this return keyword. So this will happen at the end of the function. This might not seem useful to you, but it actually is nice because if there's something that you need to do, like cleaning up a file or closing something, and you don't want to forget about it, you can just defer that statement at the very beginning of the function so that whoever's reading this or yourself knows that this is going to happen, and then it won't happen until the end of the function. So this is a very useful keyword that I don't know what other languages it's actually in, but if you write defer and some statement, then it will not do this statement until these values return. Now I can prove this to you because I can show fmt.println before return. And in theory, if you didn't know what defer did, you'd probably think we were going to print hello and then before return, but you'll see that we print before return and then we print hello. So let's run this, go run tutorial.go. And we get before return and then hello. So this successfully deferred the execution of the statement until the exit of the function. So I know these things are a little bit more advanced than what I've shown you before. In the next video, we're going to talk more about functions and inner functions, anonymous functions, everything you pretty much need to know about them. But with that being said, that has been this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.